All right, guys, so we're going to officially start kind of putting all these building blocks together. We've already talked about Fed 10. We've talked about elections. We've talked about the bureaucracy. Last piece we need here in order to really dive in to campaign finance, which is objectively very difficult to comprehend, is interest groups. And I think once you've got all of these in your tool belt, that's going to make a lot more sense. So when it comes to interest groups, the question that we need to answer is this. So how do citizens, businesses, and other interests influence lawmaking and policy in this country? And how has the government regulated their actions, right? And you're going to see here in a moment, interest groups are quite powerful. And anything that's very powerful and very wealthy in this country, there's always going to be some regulations, right? So in your mind, I just kind of want you to consider, are there enough regulations? Should there be more? Should there be less? That's all up to you. Now, I will also say this before we kind of get started here. Everything that we've learned up until this point in this unit has been very objective, right? The bureaucracy works a certain way. Elections work a certain way. Fed 10 was written forever ago. The words aren't changing. But when it comes to interest groups and campaign finance, those are both very controversial things. And there are often candidates who run for office who want to reform, change, get rid of, or add to the way that things are currently set up. So we're moving from kind of objectivity to subjectivity. And as you guys kind of read through this, I want you guys to have a little bit of a healthy dose of skepticism. Is this the way that things should be, in my opinion? That's what you should be asking yourself. So one other thing that's super important when it comes to interest groups is Fed 10. So I need you guys to make this automatic association in your head between interest groups and factions. Interest groups, by definition, are factions. And when James Madison's talking about factions in Fed 10, today, that largely manifests itself in the form of interest groups. And as you can see here, we have the quote from Fed 10. So by a faction, I mean a group of citizens united and actuated by some common interest or passion adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the aggregate interest of the community. So a faction is a group of citizens that have this idea or ideas in common, and as it says here, they're adverse to the rights of other citizens. So they want their way, and if you don't want that, then screw you, okay? That's kind of how factions work. That's because, right, human nature is inherently evil per se, and that's how James Madison has our system set up, right? So factions, interest groups, you need to make that association. And I'm sure I'll refer to it plenty of times when we're going through this. So quick background of interest groups. And in this video, there's going to be a lot of words. I understand that. I apologize, but also it's there so you have additional information. Make sure that the bold and underlined stuff you take down in your notes. The stuff that's not bold and underlined, generally speaking, is going to be extra information. So like I already said, interest groups have often been viewed with suspicion. And in Fed 10, James Madison talks all about how factions, despite their fact that these guys are inevitable, because we have liberty, factions exist, they're also very dangerous. And we can't eliminate them because by eliminating them, we're eliminating liberty. So instead, we must control their effects. And that's done through separation of powers. That is done through having a large republic. And that is done by having competent representatives. So here's how interest groups work. They have a bunch of important functions. Function number one, they raise awareness about a cause and they get folks interested by educating people about that cause. I'm going to use the NRA quite often. I'll use the NAACP quite often as examples of how this works. So for example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, they would raise awareness about why it is important for every American to own a gun. And they would try to educate the public on why they are correct and their haters are wrong. NAACP, they're going to raise awareness to the challenges that African Americans face in 2021, and they're going to educate people on that fact. In addition, interest groups exist because they have membership, right? An interest group is not a person, it is many people. And I'm not talking 5 people, I'm talking hundreds or thousands, okay? So interest groups, first and foremost, they represent their membership. Their membership exists, right? People are members for a reason because they believe in a certain cause. And the interest groups link those people, their membership, to the government. That's why they are a linkage institution, because they link the people to the government. Interest groups, I think this is one of the things that gets underreported about interest groups, but the reality is this third bullet is, or I guess fourth, but third function, is the chief thing that interest groups do. This is what they spend most of their time doing, and that is providing information to the government in the form of data and testimony. So the NRA, for example, would say, well, all these people are trying to ban assault rifles, but here's how many assault rifles are in the country, and here's how many of them are being used for improper purposes, right? Clearly, assault rifles should not be banned. And then they would testify perhaps before Congress with this data, if Congress is really curious, and they would say, here's why I think what I think, and this is why, you should take this certain course of action. The NAACP, they'd say, here is data on how African Americans are still marginalized in this community. And again, they'd make testimony if they're asked to. Now, interest groups, in addition to being a linkage institution, they also unite people together. So interest groups are a way that people who are passionate about a certain cause can get involved. And this is what I was talking about at the end of the Fed 10 video, is that the existence of factions, interest groups are factions, right? They result in a more informed populace. So if you're a member of an interest group, you are more aware of what's going on in Congress, naturally. Interest groups allow people to work together to achieve a common goal. You want, HBCUs to have more funding. Go through the NAACP and get your data to Congress, talk with these folks, and get them to do what you want. Give them a reason to do what you're advocating for. So there are a few different types of interest groups that we'll go over. The first and foremost, probably the more famous type of interest group is an economic interest group. So within the economic interest group bubble are 3 main types of groups, and that is labor groups, business groups, and agricultural groups. Now, these guys form together based on shared economic interests, right? So labor groups, this is going to be like your working folks, right? And I'll go more into detail on these in a second. Labor groups want, for example, higher minimum wage or more safety protocols in the workplace. Whereas business groups want to be able to make as much money as possible. And that means cutting corners if necessary and lowering regulations on business. Agricultural groups obviously want to make as much money as possible via agriculture, so farming, etc. So let's talk labor groups. The goal of labor groups is to promote organized labor. And when I say organized labor, what I'm talking about is labor unions. If you're not super familiar with labor unions, I'm gonna obviously talk about them here a little bit, but do a little bit of independent research on those. I'm kind of operating under the assumption, for better or for worse, that you have a moderate understanding of them because they were taught so much in AP US history, but I also, understand the challenges with relying on, the knowledge you get from another course. So labor unions are formed when employees band together and they negotiate with their employer. So For example, let's say you work in a factory that makes Ford cars, right? You were working on an assembly line, for example, and you and your fellow workers feel like you're unpaid. The company has, Ford, for example. I don't think this is actually true. They don't have air conditioning in their factories, or I don't know, maybe they're making you work really long hours and they're not giving you overtime pay. Whatever the case may be, you're upset. So you can band together with your fellow employees and form what is called a union. You can register that union with the state that you live in. So in that case, it'd be the state of Michigan. That's where most cars are made. And you can negotiate with your employers. You can say, okay, well, you're gonna get air conditioning in our factories. You're gonna pay us a higher minimum wage. Otherwise, we're just gonna stop working for you. We're gonna go on strike. So labor unions kind of empower the workers within a business. And generally speaking, labor groups support the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, generally speaking, advocates for higher minimum wage and advocates for laws to be passed that, generally speaking, cause businesses to have to spend money on maybe it's workplace safety or environmental regulations, whatever the case may be. So labor groups, as you can probably imagine, are completely diametrically opposed to business groups. They hate each other. Labor groups, want the business groups to pay them more wage, or the business owners, to pay them a higher wage, to have a more adequate workplace, maybe more days off, etc. Whereas business groups want to make as much money as possible. So they're not going to want to pay their workers. They're going to want to pay their workers as little as possible, right? And they're going to want as little regulations as possible so they can do whatever they need to do in their business to make money. So some examples of labor groups: the United Auto Workers, I already kind of gave an example of them. The UAW, they're probably the largest labor union, if I had to guess. The Teamsters Union is a bunch of people from all walks of life who are advocating for a higher minimum wage. Teachers unions are very popular in states that are not Arkansas. There's not a ton of teachers unions in Arkansas anymore. And another popular one would be the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union. They actually just went on strike about a week ago. Right now I'm filming this on January 24th, so last week. They went on strike and they got a higher wage. So these do work. So, wow, I did not need to make all of those have a thing. Okay, so when it comes to labor groups and where they donate their money, I'm just going to show you guys a figure. So the blue bars are donations to Democrats and the red bars are donations to the Republicans. And light blue bar just means they're donating to other liberal interest groups. So as you can see, these bars are very blue and not very red. And you can kind of see some of the different unions that donated money in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. You guys can pause it if you want to take a look further at this. All right. So let's talk business groups, also known as corporate groups. You might see either on your AP test. I feel like business, corporation are kind of synonymous, so you should be able to make that, logical jump. So I've already kind of touched on these a little bit because they're like the mortal enemy of labor groups. Business groups exist to promote and protect business interests, and their goal is to create as much revenue as possible. Business groups answer to stockholders and shareholders. That's how corporations are run. Stockholders and shareholders generate the capital for the business to function. So they need to be pleased by the amount of revenue that their business is making. So I've already talked about how they're diametrically opposed to labor groups. Generally speaking, business groups give to the Republican Party. The Republican Party is generally for less government regulation, which would therefore allow businesses to, do their thing. Another thing I did not touch on necessarily with labor groups that I will here is that the Democratic Party tends to support laws being passed that would limit the amount of impact that a business can have on the environment. So things like pollution, for example, or CO2 emissions, whatever the case may be. Democrats tend to support that. So business groups would not necessarily want to give to Democrats, because any time that an environmental restriction is passed, that means businesses have to spend money to comply with that regulation. So generally speaking, business groups do not support the Democratic Party, they support the Republican Party. And some examples, the American Petroleum Institute has a lot of money. That's going to be like your oil companies. The US Chamber of Commerce, weirdly enough, is a business group in addition to being part of the bureaucracy. They're an exception kind of to the rule because they want as much money to be made as possible. They give to the Republican Party. Obviously, it's kind of problematic, but the US Chamber of Commerce is protected by the Supreme Court to make campaign donations. And the National Federation of Independent Business has a lot of businesses who have kind of joined into that interest group. So again, the blue bars are Democrats, the red bars are the Republicans, and you can see clearly that a majority of that money is being given to Republicans. This is in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. So again, this is referring to the midterms, not the actual 2020-21 election. Okay, agricultural groups are a specific type of business group. So any kind of figure you see that has business groups in it, agricultural groups are kind of grouped inside the business, but agricultural groups have a different focus, and they do want you to know this for the AP test. So agricultural groups also want to maximize revenue, but they're also focused very much so on agriculture, as you can probably imagine. And that means they want subsidies for farms, and they want the prices of crops and things to be favorable to them. So generally speaking, they give to the Republican Party because, again, the Republican Party, generally speaking, is for less governmental regulation. Now, grouped in with agriculture groups are going to be like the sugar industry, the dairy industry, tobacco, lumber industries. Those guys are all agricultural groups, and they, generally speaking, give a lot of money to the Republicans, as you can see. And obviously, again, always feel free to pause and look. Now, one interesting thing is this, and I'm gonna use this bar to illustrate this point. There are some interest groups that give exactly equal money to both parties. And I'm gonna use Juul as an example here. Juul is like a little vape thing, right? So generally speaking, if a corporation or labor union, whatever, if they just want the government to stay out of their business, they're going to give to both parties. So that way both parties are inclined to kind of let them be. So Juul, for example, so e-cigarettes are fairly unregulated right now. So in order to stay unregulated, as you can see, Juul kind of gives equally to both parties. The alcohol industry also tends to do this as well. Just kind of stay out of our business, let us do our thing, let us sell our alcohol. So in addition to economic interest groups, so under the economic interest group bubble, right, you have labor, business, and agricultural groups. We're moving into a separate sect of interest groups, and that is interest groups that promote causes. So very famous would be the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Rifle Association, groups that support welfare of specific people, such as the NAACP. The American Association of Retired Persons is a very large one. Veterans of foreign wars. Yeah, you guys kind of get the point. So these guys are all for a specific cause. Now, within those causes, you can kind of divide them up. So there are public interest groups, which are concerned with things that affect the entire population, such as the environment or crime or civil rights. And some examples of that would be Greenpeace is a huge one that supports the environment and environmental regulations in particular. Moms Demand Action is a large one that has kind of formed after the spree of school shootings we've had. I'm not even gonna say recently because they've been going on for forever. But these guys are advocating for stricter gun control. League of Women's Voters wants female inequality. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you can imagine what that's for. The private prison industry would also be another one. They want as little regulation as possible, right? And here is a very interesting map from PBS on the amount of, and we're going to get into PACs in just a second, but the amount of PACs that are associated with each of these types of groups. A PAC is basically just the avenue that group takes to spend money on elections. We'll go into detail on that in a second, but as you can see, there are significantly more corporate groups than there are anything else. So here are just a few strategies of interest groups. This is what an interest group does. First, they encourage their members to vote for candidates who support the views of that interest group. So again, we were talking about how, one might support the Democratic Party more than others, and another interest group might support the Republican Party more than others. They're going to basically give a list of candidates to vote for to their members. Obviously, the members don't have to vote the way the interest group wants, but generally speaking, they do. Interest groups also work to influence the party platforms and any particular candidate in a primary. So remember, at the national convention, the platform and the candidate is officially chosen. Interest groups are going to provide data and provide reasoning and support for specific causes. And generally speaking, if there's enough data and enough support to back that interest group, their idea is going to make it onto a platform. And interest groups also campaign and contribute money to parties and candidates through PACs and super PACs. That is where interest groups intersect with campaign finance. And this bullet is what we're going to go over in detail in this upcoming video. So don't freak out too much about this last one. We're going to go into that. So few other strategies of interest groups. So we've got influencing elections as strategy number one. Strategy number two, lobbying. So lobbying, here's your definition right here, and that is attempting to influence policymakers by supplying data to them. So they're gonna, interest groups are going to collect data to prove that they have the correct view, and they're going to give that to anybody and everybody that has power that is willing to listen to them. And there's a few ways they do this. Direct lobbying is the most common, and that is using person-to-person contact, scheduling a meeting with a legislator, for example, and saying, hey, here's the data, they'll give them a nice little folder. Here's the data, here's my reason, let's talk about it, do you have any questions? Grassroots lobbying is also used. Remember, grassroots meaning at the local level. So they're gonna, get together in their own little local community, and they're gonna write letters to politicians. They're gonna make phone calls to politicians, send emails, all that good stuff to try and get the politicians to do what they want. And lastly, coalition lobbying is really interesting. It's a very important strategy when it comes to connecting this to Federalist 10. Coalition lobbying is when several interest groups that have kind of common ideas will join together to lobby specific policymakers. Obviously there's strength in numbers, so doing that helps. And when it comes to Fed 10, remember, you've got all of these different factions or interest groups, right, who are competing with one another to get their policies passed. And if you have coalition lobbying, that's like multiple factions working together, right? So it gives you a little bit more power. Next strategy is litigation, right? So for our strategies so far, we've got influencing elections, we've got lobbying, and now we've got litigation. And your definition here is taking an issue to court. So if you're unsuccessful in your lobbying and you don't, have enough people in Congress bankrolled to get your, position taken care of, you can always sue. So this strategy was used very often in the 1950s during the civil rights movement by the NAACP. They were suing the hell out of everybody, talking about how this is illegal, this is illegal, this is illegal, and they won a lot. Think Brown versus Board, right? And the term here is going public as well. So when you're suing the government or an agency who's doing something wrong, when you're making a lawsuit, you're going to appeal to the public and say, hey guys, look at what the government is doing. What they're doing is illegal, and you should be upset about it. And generally speaking, if the public is just up in arms, right, the media is covering the lawsuit, right, the litigation has a higher chance of passing because even judges are, susceptible to public pressure. And one example here that you're about to read is the most famous court case that's happened here in the last 10 years, and that is Citizens United versus the FEC. We'll go over that shortly. So we're going to get into Citizens United. We're going to get into campaign finance, but first, fill out that Google Doc. I'll catch you in a minute.